Mortar shell decapitation. On July 4th, 2011, residents of Fargo, North Dakota gathered for what should have been a typical Independence Day celebration. A 41-year-old construction worker and father of three had purchased professional-grade fireworks for the neighborhood display. Among them was a 3-inch mortar shell, a cylindrical explosive designed to be launched from a tube and detonate high in the air. As darkness fell, he began the show. Children sat on blankets while adults stood watching the colorful explosions overhead. Around 9:45 p.m., he loaded one of the mortar shells into its tube. He lit the fuse and stepped back, but something went wrong. The fuse burned down, but the firework failed to launch. After waiting approximately 30 seconds, he approached the tube. This was his critical mistake. Professional mortar shells contain enough explosive powder to propel them hundreds of feet into the air. They are not meant to be handled after a failed ignition attempt. Witnesses later reported that he leaned directly over the tube, presumably to check if the fuse was still lit. In that moment, the delayed chemical reaction finally triggered. The mortar exploded with its full force while still inside the launch tube. The explosion created a focused upward blast wave. The shell, traveling at an estimated 300 feet per second, struck his neck and jawline. The impact severed his head from his body completely. The force was so violent that witnesses 20 feet away felt the concussion wave. Neighborhood children who had been watching the display screamed as they saw his body collapse to the ground. His head had been thrown nearly 15 feet away by the force of the blast. Adults rushed to shield the children's eyes, but for many, it was already too late. First responders arrived within minutes, but there was nothing to be done. The 41-year-old construction worker had died instantly. His brainstem severed before his consciousness could even register the explosion. The Human Firework. On July 4th, 2015, in the small border town of Calais, Maine, a 22-year-old man was celebrating Independence Day with friends. The evening had been filled with drinking, laughter, and increasingly poor decision-making. By 11 p.m., the group had consumed significant amounts of alcohol, and their judgment was severely impaired. The man, a former Disney World employee who once played Gaston in park performances, had been setting off fireworks throughout the evening. Among their collection was a reloadable mortar tube, a professional-grade pyrotechnic that launches explosive shells hundreds of feet into the air. These devices contain enough of black powder to create substantial force, approximately equivalent to a quarter stick of dynamite. As the night progressed and inhibitions lowered, he announced what he claimed would be a joke. He placed the 3-inch diameter mortar tube on top of his head, balancing it like a hat. His friends later reported that they thought he was merely pretending and had no actual intention of lighting it. In a split-second decision that would prove fatal, he held a lighter to the fuse while the tube remained positioned on his skull. The mortar was pointed downward, meaning the explosive force would be directed directly into his head, rather than propelling a shell upward. The fuse burned quickly, taking just under 2 seconds. When it reached the charge, the explosion created instantaneous catastrophic damage. The force shattered his skull, driving bone fragments into his brain. The heat from the blast simultaneously caused third-degree burns to the remaining tissue. His friends witnessed the moment of detonation in stunned horror. The top of his head essentially disappeared in the explosion. He collapsed immediately, blood pooling beneath what remained of his skull. Despite frantic calls to emergency services, there was no possibility of survival. Medical examiners later confirmed that death had been instantaneous. The blast wave had destroyed his brainstem, ending all neural activity before his body even hit the ground. Highway Bridge Collapse. On February 1st, 2013, an ordinary morning commute in China's Henan province became a scene of unprecedented destruction. Shortly after 7 a.m., a cargo truck heavily loaded with fireworks approached the Yichang Bridge near Sanmenxia City. The elevated expressway, standing 90 feet above the ground, carried thousands of vehicles daily across the Yi River. The truck contained approximately 6 tons of commercial fireworks destined for Lunar New Year celebrations. Chinese regulations classified these particular pyrotechnics as 1.3G explosives, professional-grade materials with substantial explosive potential. Under Chinese law, such cargo required special permits and safety protocols, none of which the driver possessed. Traffic was moving at approximately 40 miles per hour, and witnesses noticed smoke coming from the truck's cargo area. The driver, likely aware of the imminent danger, attempted to pull over on the bridge shoulder. He never made it. At 7:28 a.m., the first explosion occurred. It was relatively small but ignited the remaining inventory. Within 3 seconds, the primary detonation followed. The blast created a pressure wave estimated at 35 pounds per square inch, strong enough to rupture internal organs at close range. The explosion's force transferred directly into the bridge's concrete support columns. Engineers later explained that the concentrated energy overwhelmed the structure's load-bearing capacity. The reinforced concrete, designed to withstand vertical pressure but not explosive force, cracked and then shattered. A section of roadway measuring 260 feet collapsed almost immediately. Surveillance footage showed the bridge buckling like a wave before disintegrating. 26 vehicles, including 5 trucks and 17 cars, plunged nearly 90 feet to the frozen ground below. The combined trauma of the explosion and fall was instantly fatal for most victims. Those who survived the initial blast suffered massive internal injuries from the impact. Bodies recovered showed compound fractures, severed limbs, and extensive internal hemorrhaging. Many were burned beyond recognition by the fireball that engulfed the wreckage. Among the 26 people who perished, several remained alive briefly, trapped in crushed vehicles as secondary explosions continued around them. Factory fire in chemical mixing room. On September 5, 2012, workers at Om Shakti Fireworks Industries in Sivakasi, India, arrived for what seemed like an ordinary day. The facility, located in what locals called the fireworks capital of India, was one of hundreds of manufacturing operations in the region. Like many others, it operated without proper licensing or safety protocols. By 11 a.m., the temperature in the chemical mixing room had risen to 108 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside this enclosed space, 12 workers, mostly women earning less than $4 per day, were manually mixing potassium chlorate and sulfur. These volatile compounds become dangerously unstable at high temperatures, a fact the workers had never been informed of. The facility lacked basic ventilation systems, allowing combustible dust to accumulate in the air. Static electricity from the workers' movements was the only spark needed. At 11:22 a.m., witnesses outside the building heard a sharp crack, followed by a much larger detonation. The initial explosion instantly killed the workers in the mixing room. Their bodies absorbed the full force of the blast wave, which reached temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. The explosion ignited adjoining storage areas containing pre-made fireworks, creating a chain reaction. As the fire spread, it reached a room where 38 workers were assembling consumer fireworks by hand. The room had a single exit door, which became blocked by falling debris. The windows were barred with metal grates, a common anti-theft measure that now became a death trap. Workers pressed against the windows, visible to onlookers who had gathered outside. Many were still alive, breathing in toxic smoke from burning chemicals. The smoke contained potassium chlorate particles, which caused severe internal burns to their respiratory systems. Some workers managed to squeeze through gaps in the window bars, suffering deep lacerations in the process. Those who couldn't escape remained trapped as the room filled with smoke and flames. Autopsies later revealed that many victims died not from burns but from asphyxiation, their lungs destroyed by chemical smoke. First responders arrived 30 minutes after the initial explosion, by which time 40 people had already perished. The intense heat and ongoing secondary explosions prevented rescue teams from entering the building for several hours. Fatal workplace flash fire. On May 27, 1983, a converted barn on a remote farm near Benton, Tennessee, became the site of an industrial disaster. The facility, disguised as an agricultural operation, was actually an illegal fireworks manufacturing plant, specializing in M80s and M100s, devices legally classified as boom booms rather than fireworks due to their explosive power. An M80 contains approximately 3 grams of flash powder, equivalent to about 1/4 of a stick of dynamite. The more powerful M100s contain nearly twice that amount. The facility had stockpiled materials to produce over 50,000 of these devices. At 9:15 a.m., 11 workers were inside the barn handling the explosive materials. Most were local residents with no formal training in handling hazardous compounds. They worked at tables covered with flash powder, a mixture of potassium perchlorate, aluminum, and sulfur that ignites at the slightest spark. A 52-year-old supervisor was demonstrating how to pack the powder into cardboard tubes when static electricity from his clothing created a tiny spark. Witnesses outside the barn reported hearing a sound like a single balloon popping, followed immediately by a deafening roar. The initial spark ignited the powder on his table, which in turn detonated approximately 1,000 pounds of flash powder stored throughout the building. The explosion created a pressure wave that expanded at over 17,000 feet per second. The wooden barn disintegrated instantly. Splinters of wood became lethal projectiles, some found embedded in trees over 300 yards away. The shockwave liquefied the internal organs of everyone inside. Their lungs ruptured from the sudden pressure change, and the brain hemorrhaging occurred before they could process what was happening. 10 of the 11 workers died instantly, their bodies torn apart by the blast. Incredibly, one worker survived the initial explosion but suffered third-degree burns over 80% of his body. First responders found him walking in circles, in shock, his clothes blown completely off and his skin hanging in sheets. The explosion was so powerful that residents in Chattanooga, 20 miles away, reported hearing the blast and feeling their windows rattle. The crater where the barn once stood measured 38 feet across and 12 feet deep. Instant throat strike in backyard. On July 4th, 2013, a 19-year-old father of two was celebrating Independence Day in the backyard of his Oklahoma home. He had invited family and friends for a barbecue and fireworks display. His wife and children were among those gathered on lawn chairs as darkness fell. He had purchased several consumer-grade fireworks, including a multi-shot aerial repeater commonly called a cake. These devices contain multiple tubes fused together to fire sequentially, launching colorful bursts into the sky in rapid succession. This particular cake contained 36 shots and was designed to create a finale-like display. At approximately 9:45 p.m., he set up the cake on a flat portion of his backyard. He lit the fuse and retreated to a safe distance. The first few shots launched normally, exploding in bright colors overhead. Then the firing sequence stopped unexpectedly. After waiting 30 seconds, he made the fatal decision to approach the device. This violated the most basic safety principle of firework. Never approach a lit firework, even if it appears to have malfunctioned. As his family watched, he bent over the cake to examine it. Inside the device, the fuse had not extinguished, but merely slowed. As his face came within inches of the tubes, the smoldering fuse reached the next charge. The aerial shell, a cylindrical projectile containing flash powder and color-producing chemicals, fired directly at him. The shell struck his throat at point-blank range with a velocity of approximately 200 feet per second. It did not explode on impact but continued into his neck. When it detonated a split second later, the explosion occurred inside his throat. The blast severed his carotid arteries and jugular vein instantly. It also fractured his cervical vertebrae and ruptured his trachea. Blood sprayed in an arc as he fell backward onto the lawn. His wife screamed and ran toward him, while others grabbed the children to shield their eyes. He remained conscious for approximately 20 seconds as blood filled his severed airway. Unable to breathe or speak, he locked eyes with his wife as she reached him, before losing consciousness from rapid blood loss. Death by detonated firework shell. On January 1st, 2022, a rural celebration outside Dresden, Germany, became the scene of a gruesome incident. A group of 7 friends had gathered at an isolated farm property to celebrate the new year with drinks and illegal fireworks. Among them was a 39-year-old construction worker who had purchased black market pyrotechnics from Eastern Europe. The centerpiece of his collection was a spherical shell measuring 6 inches in diameter. This type of professional display firework is typically launched from a mortar tube and detonates hundreds of feet in the air. The shell contained approximately 4 ounces of flash powder, enough explosive force to be felt from 50 yards away. Such devices are strictly regulated in Germany and require licensing for purchase and use. His shell was not only illegal, but also lacked basic safety features like proper fusing and delay charges. By midnight, the group had consumed significant amounts of alcohol. The outdoor temperature was near freezing, and a light snow had begun to fall. Minutes after the clock struck 12, he decided to light the shell. Rather than using a proper launching tool, he placed it on the ground and lit the fuse with a cigarette lighter. The manufacturer's recommended safety distance for professionals handling such devices is 100 yards. He stood less than 3 feet away. The fuse, designed for professional timing systems, burned faster than expected. He had no time to retreat before ignition. When the device detonated, it did not launch upward as designed, but exploded at ground level with its full force directed outward. The blast wave struck his face and upper body first. The pressure front, moving at over 7,000 feet per second, shattered his facial bones instantly. Fragments of the shell's casing became shrapnel, penetrating his face and neck at velocities comparable to bullets. His friends, standing several yards back, were knocked to the ground, but escaped serious injury. When they recovered and approached him, they found a scene so grisly that 2 immediately vomited. The explosion had completely obliterated his facial features, leaving an unrecognizable mass of tissue. He remained alive for approximately 40 seconds, his brain still functioning despite catastrophic damage to his face and airways. He attempted to breathe through a ruined trachea, producing a gurgling sound that his friends would later describe as the most disturbing thing they had ever heard. Illegal cake bomb explosion. On January 1st, 2025, residents of Aleamanu, Hawaii gathered for their annual neighborhood New Year's celebration. The block party had grown each year, with 2025's event attracting over 100 people to the residential street. Among them were 3 women in their 30s, close friends who had attended the celebration together for several years. At 11:45 p.m., a local resident brought out what he called his special surprise. It was an illegally modified firework device known as a cake bomb, a consumer-grade multi-shot aerial repeater that had been altered to fire simultaneously rather than in sequence. The original manufacturer designed the device to launch 36 separate shots over 40 seconds. He had rewired it to trigger all charges at once. Next to this modified cake, he had positioned a stockpile of additional aerial shells and rockets. Hawaii state law prohibits consumer possession of any aerial fireworks, and the total explosive material present exceeded legal limits by over 20 times. The crowd gathered in a semicircle approximately 30 feet from the display. At 11:59 p.m., he lit the fuse and hurried back toward the crowd. The modified cake began to tip as soon as the first tubes ignited. Instead of shooting upward, the flaming projectiles fired horizontally into the nearby pile of additional fireworks. The chain reaction took less than 2 seconds to develop. Dozens of aerial shells detonated at ground level, creating a rapidly expanding cloud of fire, sparks, and shrapnel. The first woman, standing directly in the path of the main explosion, received the worst injuries. The blast wave reached them first, traveling at over 1,000 feet per second. The pressure front ruptured their eardrums instantly and caused immediate barotrauma to their lungs. Milliseconds later, burning fragments struck their bodies at high velocity. Standing directly in the path of the main explosion received the worst injuries. Metal fragments from shell casings penetrated her torso and neck, severing her carotid artery. She collapsed immediately, blood pulsing from her neck wound. The second and third women remained standing briefly, their bodies penetrated by dozens of burning fragments. The flash powder ignited their clothing, engulfing them in flames. Their screams joined the chaos of noise as bystanders scattered in panic. Within 30 seconds, all 3 women had lost consciousness from blood loss and shock. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.